You're just a burden, Margaret. Honestly, I do not know how Daniel has put up with you this long. She did not whisper it. She did not lower her voice. She said it clearly, standing less than 5 feet away from me, holding a glass of champagne as if she were making a casual observation instead of rewriting my place in my own family. A few people nearby laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke. No one corrected her. No one looked at me long enough to acknowledge what had just happened. I smiled. Not because it was funny. Not because I agreed. But because I understood something in that exact moment that I had missed for years. This was not a slip of the tongue. This was a conclusion. And it had been reached long before tonight. I am glad you are here. Stay with me, because what happened next was not what anyone in that room expected. The chandelier above us cast a warm golden light across the room, reflecting off polished glass and silver cutlery arranged with careful precision. Everything about the evening had been designed to feel perfect. My son Daniel's 40th birthday. A private event space overlooking the city skyline. White orchids on every table. A custom cake that cost more than my first car. I had approved every detail. Paid for half of it myself. And yet, standing there, I felt like an afterthought placed at the edge of something I no longer recognized. I adjusted the sleeve of my blazer slowly, smoothing a wrinkle that was not there, giving my hand something to do while the word settled. Burden. It lingered in the air longer than the music, longer than the laughter, longer than anything else that had been said that evening. I turned my head slightly, meeting Ashley's eyes. She smiled at me, calm, composed, as if nothing had happened. That was her strength. She never raised her voice. She never created scenes. She shaped perception quietly, one sentence at a time. I returned the smile. Just enough to keep the moment from expanding. Then I looked past her, toward Daniel. He was standing near the bar, laughing with 2 men in tailored suits, his hand resting casually on the counter, his posture relaxed. He had heard her. I knew he had. But he did not turn. He did not pause. He did not correct her. He simply continued his conversation, as if the word had not been spoken at all. That was when something shifted inside me. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet, precise adjustment. Like a lens coming into focus after being blurred for far too long. A server passed by with a tray of champagne. I declined with a small shake of my head and reached for a glass of water instead. My fingers were steady. My breath was even. Nothing about me reflected what had just been said. And that was exactly the point. Across the room, I heard someone whisper, "Is that his mother?" Another voice responded, "I think so. Ashley mentioned she lives with them now. Lives with them." I almost laughed. Not out loud. Just enough for myself. Narratives do not need to be accurate. They only need to be repeated. I moved through the room slowly, greeting guests, thanking them for coming, asking about their work, their families, their travels. I had spent decades doing this. Hosting. Supporting. Building connections that Daniel now stood on without ever having to see the foundation beneath him. Near the far end of the room, I paused beside the large window overlooking the city. The skyline stretched out in front of me, light steady, unbothered by anything happening inside this carefully constructed space. For a moment, I let the silence settle. Not around me. Within me. Behind me, Ashley's voice carried again, light, effortless, perfectly controlled. "We are managing everything," she said to a small group. At her age, it is more about support than independence. A few sympathetic nods followed. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I had heard enough. Slowly, I reached into my purse and let my fingers rest against a folded document I had placed there earlier that afternoon. Thick paper. Legal letterhead. Numbers that did not align with the version of me being described just a few feet away. I had almost left it at home. Almost convinced myself it was unnecessary. That respect did not require proof. I was wrong. I withdrew my hand, leaving the document where it was. Not yet. Timing matters. They had already decided who I was. Tonight. They were going to learn what they had missed. And the difference between those two things was about to become impossible to ignore. I did not leave the party after that. That would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was supposed to be, moving through the room with the same quiet composure I had carried for most of my life. I stopped by the dessert table and adjusted the placement of the serving plates, straightened a fork that had been set at the wrong angle, and thanked the catering staff as if my evening had not been carefully unraveled just moments earlier. It was not denial. It was observation. Every word Ashley had spoken lingered, but instead of reacting, I began to notice things I had overlooked before. The way she positioned herself at the center of every conversation, guiding people with subtle gestures, deciding who Daniel spoke to and for how long. The way she answered questions that were not directed at her, especially when those questions had anything to do with family matters. I watched as a man in a dark suit approached Daniel and asked something about investments, and before my son could respond, Ashley stepped in smoothly, her voice warm and confident, explaining that Daniel had been focusing on new opportunities and that they were being very selective about who they worked with. Daniel nodded along, smiling, as if the words were his own. I felt a familiar ache then, not sharp, but persistent. It had been years since Daniel made a decision without first looking to her. Years since he called me to ask for advice. Years since my voice carried any weight in his life. I moved toward the bar and asked for a glass of still water. The bartender handed it to me with a polite smile, and I thanked him, noticing how my reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface of the counter. For a moment, I studied the woman looking back at me. 68 years old. Silver hair carefully styled. A posture that had learned to remain upright no matter the circumstance. There was no sign of a burden there. Only a woman who had spent decades building something she had believed would last. A group of guests gathered nearby, their conversation drifting toward me in fragments. Ashley said his mother moved in last year, one of them said. Must be difficult, another replied. At that age, you know, it becomes a responsibility. Responsibility. Another word, softer than burden, but carrying the same quiet dismissal. I turned slightly, pretending to examine the floral arrangement on a nearby table while I listened. I heard they are thinking of expanding the house, the first voice continued. More space, especially with everything they have going on. Expanding the house. I knew exactly what that meant. Not making room for me, but making room around me, adjusting the structure so I could be contained, managed, tucked away. I closed my eyes briefly, just long enough to steady the rhythm of my breath. Then I opened them again and set the glass down. Across the room, Ashley was laughing again, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, guiding him toward another group of guests. She caught my eye for a brief second and offered a small, knowing smile. It was not kind. It was not cruel. It was certain. Certain that she understood the entire narrative of this family. Certain that I had already been placed in my role. I returned the smile, just as measured, just as controlled. Because in that moment, I understood something she did not. Control is often mistaken for ownership. And ownership is often assumed without proof. A server passed by carrying a tray of small appetizers, and I took one, more out of habit than hunger. I held it between my fingers, untouched, as I continued to observe. Near the entrance, I noticed a familiar figure speaking quietly with the event coordinator. Tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with precise elegance. He had arrived later than expected, which had not gone unnoticed by me, even before everything else unfolded. He glanced across the room, his eyes briefly meeting mine, and gave a subtle nod. It was enough. I felt the final piece settle into place. The conversations, the assumptions, the quiet rewriting of my role in this family, all of it had been happening for longer than I had allowed myself to admit. Not overnight. Not suddenly. Gradually. Carefully. And now, openly. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the center of the room, my steps steady, my expression unchanged. The music swelled slightly as the band transitioned into another song, and guests began to gather closer to the cake, anticipating the next part of the evening. I took my place near the edge of the group, close enough to be seen, but not close enough to be included in whatever Ashley had planned next. For years, I had believed that silence was a form of peace. That stepping back would allow others to step forward without conflict. That love, given consistently, would eventually be returned in kind. Tonight, I understood the flaw in that thinking. Silence does not always create peace. Sometimes, it creates space for others to define you. And as I stood there, watching my son prepare to make a speech about his life, his success, and the people who had supported him along the way, I realized that I had allowed that definition to take shape without ever questioning it. That would not happen again. Daniel tapped his glass gently with a spoon, the soft chime cutting through the music and drawing the room's attention toward him. Conversations faded, chairs shifted, and within seconds, all eyes were on him. He stood tall, confident, exactly the way I had once imagined he would be at this stage of his life. His suit was perfectly tailored, his smile effortless, his presence commanding. For a brief moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would run into my arms after school, his backpack too heavy for his small shoulders, his voice full of excitement as he told me about his day. Then the moment passed, replaced by the man he had become. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice warm and practiced. Turning 40 is a milestone I could not have reached without the incredible people in my life. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd. Glasses were raised. Heads nodded. I stood quietly among them, my hands resting lightly in front of me, listening. He continued, speaking about his career, his achievements, the opportunities that had come his way over the years. He mentioned colleagues. Mentors, friends who had supported him, each name carefully chosen, each acknowledgement delivered with precision. Ashley stood just to his left, her expression glowing with pride, her posture angled slightly toward him, as if she were both his partner and his reflection. When he spoke about his marriage, his voice softened. "And of course, none of this would mean anything without Ashley," he said, reaching for her hand. "She has been my anchor, my guide, and the reason I have been able to focus on building the life we have today." Applause followed, warm and enthusiastic. Ashley smiled, lowering her gaze modestly for just a second before looking back up, perfectly timed. I watched them, the seamless coordination, the unspoken rhythm between them. It was impressive. It was also revealing. Daniel paused, glancing briefly across the room as if searching for something. For someone. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met mine. Then he looked away. The moment was so small that no one else would have noticed. But I did. He cleared his throat lightly and continued. "Family has always been important to me," he said. "It is the foundation of everything." The word hung in the air, polished and hollow at the same time. I felt the faintest tightening in my chest, not from pain, but from recognition. Words can be shaped into anything when they are no longer anchored to truth. He spoke for a few more minutes, wrapping his speech with gratitude and optimism, painting a picture of a life that looked complete, balanced, and entirely self-made. When he finished, the room filled with applause again, louder this time. Glasses clinked. The band struck a celebratory chord. Ashley leaned in and kissed his cheek, and cameras flashed from several directions, capturing the moment exactly as it was meant to be seen. Perfect. I remained where I was, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady. Around me, guests began to move again, some heading toward the cake, others returning to their conversations. I overheard a man nearby say, "He has done well for himself." Another replied, "Smart couple. They know how to position themselves." Position themselves. I almost nodded. That was exactly what this was. Positioning. Carefully arranged, strategically presented, designed to create a specific impression. And for most of the room, it worked. I turned slightly, my gaze drifting once more toward the entrance. The man in the charcoal suit had stepped further inside now, standing just beyond the main cluster of guests. He spoke briefly with the event coordinator again, then checked his watch, his movements precise, unhurried. He did not belong to this celebration, not in the way the others did. He was not here for appearances. He was here for timing. I felt a quiet certainty settle over me again, stronger this time, clearer. Everything that had been said tonight, every assumption that had been allowed to grow, was about to be tested against something far less flexible than perception. Facts do not adjust themselves to fit a narrative. They stand exactly where they are, waiting to be acknowledged. Ashley's voice rose again, bright and controlled, as she began directing guests toward the cake. "Everyone, if you could gather here," she said, gesturing gracefully. "We are about to sing." People moved quickly, drawn by the promise of another shared moment. I stepped forward just enough to be included in the outer circle, close enough to see Daniel clearly, but still positioned at the edge. The candles were lit, small flames flickering against the polished surface of the cake. The room dimmed slightly, the lighting adjusted to enhance the effect. Faces glowed in the soft light, anticipation building. As the first notes of the birthday song began, I found myself watching not the cake, not the candles, but the expressions around me. Smiles, laughter, easy familiarity. And beneath it, something else. Expectation. Not of what was about to be revealed, but of what had already been decided. Who belonged where? Who mattered? Who did not? I let the song carry on without joining in, my lips remaining still, my gaze steady. For years, I had been part of moments like this, contributing quietly, ensuring everything ran smoothly, believing that presence alone was enough to define my place. Tonight, I understood that presence without recognition becomes invisible. And invisibility, when accepted long enough, becomes identity. I would not accept that identity. Not anymore. The song ended in a swell of voices and soft laughter, and Daniel leaned forward to blow out the candles as cameras flashed again, capturing the exact moment his expression shifted from anticipation to satisfaction. Applause followed, louder than before, filling the room with a kind of warmth that felt carefully rehearsed. I clapped along with everyone else, my hands moving in quiet rhythm, my face composed, my presence acknowledged only in the most general sense. Ashley stepped forward immediately after, placing a hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder as she began directing the next sequence of the evening. "Let us cut the cake," she said with an easy smile, her tone bright and effortless, as though she had always been the one in charge of these moments. Guests gathered closer, forming a tighter circle, their attention drawn to the center where everything important seemed to happen. I remained at the edge, exactly where I had been placed without anyone needing to say it out loud. As the first slice of cake was cut, I noticed how Ashley handed the initial pieces to specific people, each selection intentional. Business partners. Close friends. Individuals whose presence mattered for reasons that extended beyond family. Daniel followed her lead, passing plates along with practiced ease, his movements aligned with hers in a way that left no space for interruption. When the plates reached the outer circle, one was offered to me by a server who did not know my name, only my position in the room. I accepted it with a polite nod, balancing it carefully in my hands, though I had no intention of eating. The sweetness in the air felt misplaced. Nearby, two women stood close together, their voices lowered but not enough to escape notice. "She seems quiet," one said, glancing in my direction. The other shrugged lightly. "Ashley mentioned she prefers to keep to herself. Less complicated that way." Less complicated. I let the word settle, recognizing the ease with which a narrative can be constructed when no one challenges it. Quiet becomes distant. Reserved becomes dependent. Presence becomes burden. I set the plate down on a nearby table, untouched, and reached for a glass of water instead. Across the room, the man in the charcoal suit had moved closer now, standing just beyond the main cluster of guests, his posture unchanged, his attention focused. He spoke briefly into his phone, his voice low and measured, then slipped it back into his pocket. His eyes lifted again, meeting mine with the same subtle acknowledgement as before. There was no urgency in his expression, only readiness. I turned my attention back to the room, allowing my gaze to move slowly across the faces gathered there. People laughed, exchanged stories, lifted their glasses in small, informal toasts. Everything appeared exactly as it should. And yet, beneath the surface, the structure of the evening had shifted in a way only I seemed to recognize. This was no longer just a celebration. It was a display. A carefully managed presentation of roles, relationships, and perceived value. Ashley moved through the crowd with ease, her presence drawing attention wherever she went. She paused near a group of Daniel's colleagues, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "We have been managing a lot lately," she said lightly. "Family transitions, responsibilities, you know how it is." A few sympathetic nods followed, expressions softening in quiet agreement. I did not need to hear the rest. The implication was already clear. I walked slowly toward a side table where a framed photograph had been placed as part of the decor. It showed Daniel at a younger age, standing beside me at what must have been his college graduation. His arm was around my shoulders, his smile open, unguarded. I studied the image for a moment, noting the difference not just in time, but in posture. In that photograph, there had been no question of connection. No uncertainty about belonging. I reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small correction that no one else would notice. Then I stepped back. Behind me, Ashley's voice rose again, this time addressing a larger group. "We are so grateful for everyone who has supported Daniel along the way," she said. "It really takes a strong network to build something meaningful." Strong network. The phrase lingered, polished and deliberate. I wondered, briefly, where I fit into that network as it was currently being defined. Or if I had been quietly removed from it altogether. The answer, I realized, was already in front of me. Not in what was being said, but in what was being omitted. Recognition, when absent long enough, becomes erasure. And erasure, when accepted, becomes permanent. I felt the folded document in my purse again as I shifted my stance, the faint outline pressing gently against the fabric. It was a simple thing. Paper. Ink. Numbers. And yet, it carried a weight that no spoken word in this room could match. Not because of what it represented materially, but because of what it clarified. Ownership. Contribution. Truth. I lifted my gaze once more, scanning the room with quiet precision. Daniel was laughing again, surrounded by people who admired what they believed he had built. Ashley stood beside him, her hand resting lightly at his back, guiding the flow of attention as naturally as breathing. They looked complete. Untouchable. Certain. I allowed myself a single, measured breath, then exhaled slowly. Certainty, I had learned, is often the most fragile state of all. Especially when it is built on assumptions that have never been tested. And as the evening continued to unfold, as the music played and the conversations deepened, I understood that the moment of testing was no longer something that might happen. It was something that had already begun. The music softened into something slower, more deliberate, as the evening moved into its second rhythm, the kind where conversations deepened and impressions settled into something more permanent. I remained near the side of the room, not hidden, not withdrawn, simply present in a way that required no announcement. Presence, I had learned, does not always demand attention. Sometimes, it waits. A man approached me then, one of Daniel's business associates, his handshake polite, his smile measured. "You must be Daniel's mother," he said. I nodded once. "Margaret," I replied. He introduced himself, mentioning a firm I recognized by name, speaking briefly about how impressed he was with Daniel's work. I listened, offering small acknowledgments, allowing him to finish without interruption. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Ashley speaks very highly of how much you rely on them. It is admirable, the way they take care of family." Admirable. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for the word to settle between us. "Yes," I said calmly. "Family care can take many forms." He smiled again, perhaps sensing something in my tone that he could not quite place, then excused himself to rejoin the larger group. I watched him go, noting how easily narratives travel from one person to another, shaped not by truth, but by repetition. Nearby, Ashley continued her quiet orchestration of the room, guiding conversations, introducing guests, ensuring that every interaction reinforced the image she had built. She moved with confidence, her voice steady, her expressions perfectly aligned with the role she had chosen. I could see now how carefully it had all been constructed. Not just tonight, but over time. Small comments. Subtle suggestions. Reframing my presence into something that required management rather than respect. It was not a single moment that had created this perception. It was a series of moments, layered carefully, until they formed something that felt undeniable to everyone except the one person who had never questioned it. Me. I turned slightly, my attention drawn once more to the man in the charcoal suit. He had moved closer again, now standing just beyond the outer circle of guests, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. He checked his watch once, then looked toward me, his eyes steady, waiting. Not for permission. For timing. I felt a quiet recognition pass between us, unspoken but understood. Everything that needed to be in place was already there. The only thing left was the moment itself. I reached into my purse again, this time not just to touch the document, but to feel its weight fully in my hand. The paper was smooth, the edges sharp, the ink permanent. Numbers that had been carefully accounted for over decades. Decisions made. With intention, not impulse. Contributions that had never required acknowledgement until now. I did not remove it. Not yet. Timing matters. Across the room, Daniel was engaged in another conversation, his posture relaxed, his confidence intact. He gestured as he spoke, explaining something about growth, about strategy, about the future. Ashley stood beside him, her hand resting lightly at his back again, a quiet signal of alignment. They looked certain. Certain of their place. Certain of their understanding. Certain that the story they had been telling was the only one that mattered. I took a slow breath, letting it settle evenly in my chest. Certainty, when unchallenged, becomes assumption. An assumption, when left alone, becomes belief. The room shifted slightly as more guests began to move toward the center again, drawn by the promise of another shared moment. The band adjusted their instruments, preparing for the next sequence, while servers refreshed drinks and cleared plates with quiet efficiency. Everything flowed exactly as it should. Smooth. Controlled. Predictable. I stepped forward just enough to re-enter the larger space, my movements unhurried, my expression unchanged. A few guests glanced at me as I passed, their eyes curious, their smiles polite. I returned each one with the same measured acknowledgement, offering nothing more than what was required. Near the center of the room, Ashley's voice rose again, addressing a new group, her tone light but purposeful. "It has been quite a journey," she said. "Balancing everything, especially with family needs." A few nods followed, sympathetic, understanding. The narrative continued, reinforced with each repetition, each carefully chosen word. I paused within earshot, not to interrupt, but to listen. To confirm what I already knew. And as I stood there, hearing my role defined in terms that no longer belonged to me, I realized something with complete clarity. This was not about misunderstanding. It was about control. Control of perception. Control of narrative. Control of identity. I let the realization settle without resistance. There was no need to argue with it. No need to correct it in words. Words can be reshaped, reinterpreted, dismissed. Facts cannot. I turned my head slightly, my gaze finding the man in the charcoal suit once more. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The signal was simple. The moment was near. I adjusted my posture, smoothing the front of my blazer with a steady hand. Around me, the room continued its quiet rhythm, unaware of the shift that had already begun beneath the surface. Conversations flowed. Glasses clinked. Laughter carried lightly through the air. And within that carefully maintained illusion, I stood exactly where I needed to be, no longer defined by the role that had been assigned to me, but by something far more difficult to ignore. Truth does not announce itself loudly. It waits. And when it arrives, it does not ask for permission. The room shifted again, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as the energy of the evening reached that quiet peak where attention begins to scatter and reform around whatever happens next. Conversations softened into smaller circles, laughter became more selective, and the music settled into a background hum rather than a focal point. I stood still for a moment, allowing the movement around me to pass without interruption, my awareness sharpening with each passing second. Timing is not about urgency. It is about alignment. Across the room, the man in the charcoal suit took a step forward, no longer positioned at the edge, but not yet fully within the center. He did not rush. He did not signal. He simply moved with intention, closing the distance between observation and participation. I mirrored the shift, taking a slow step forward of my own, placing myself just inside the circle of relevance, no longer at its boundary. Ashley noticed first. Her eyes moved toward me briefly, her expression unchanged, but her posture adjusting ever so slightly, as if recalibrating the space. She turned back to the group she was addressing, finishing her sentence with the same practiced ease, but I could see it now, the smallest fracture in her certainty. It was not fear. Not yet. It was awareness. Daniel remained engaged in conversation, unaware of the shift, his focus directed outward, toward the people who reflected his success back to him. He laughed at something one of his colleagues said, his voice carrying easily, his confidence intact. For a moment, I watched him, not with disappointment, not with anger, but with clarity. He had built his life on what he believed to be true. Tonight, that belief would be tested. The man in the charcoal suit reached us then, stopping just a few feet away, his presence quiet but undeniable. Ashley turned toward him, her smile immediate, professional. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite, controlled. He inclined his head slightly. "I am here to speak with Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice calm, precise. The room did not fall silent, not completely, but the immediate space around us shifted, conversations pausing just enough to register the exchange. Ashley's smile held, but her eyes flickered, just once. "I believe you mean Daniel," she replied smoothly. "He is right over there." She gestured lightly, redirecting with practiced ease. The man did not move. "No," he said, just as calmly. "I mean Mrs. Margaret Whitmore." My name, spoken clearly, without hesitation, without adjustment. I stepped forward then, closing the remaining distance between us. "That would be me," I said, my voice even, my posture steady. He turned toward me fully, acknowledging me with a small nod. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I apologize for the interruption, but the matter we discussed requires your attention at this time." There was no urgency in his tone, but there was weight. The kind that does not need to be explained. Ashley's gaze moved between us, her smile beginning to thin at the edges. "Perhaps this can wait," she said lightly. "We are in the middle of a celebration." I turned to her, meeting her eyes directly for the first time that evening without any layer of distance. "It cannot," I said simply. No explanation. No elaboration. Just truth. Daniel noticed then, his attention finally shifting toward us, his expression curious, then slightly concerned as he stepped closer. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain. The man in the charcoal suit reached into his briefcase and removed a folder, its surface clean, its contents neatly organized. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he held it in both hands, waiting, as if allowing the moment to fully arrive before moving forward. I felt the familiar weight of my own document in my purse, the edges pressing gently against the fabric, grounding me in something that could not be redefined by anyone else in the room. Around us, the conversations had slowed further, the awareness spreading outward in quiet waves. People were not staring openly, but they were listening. Watching. waiting. Ashley's posture straightened, her composure tightening, her control recalibrating once again. "Margaret," she said, her tone softer now, almost cautionary. "If this is about something personal, perhaps we should discuss it privately." I held her gaze for a moment, long enough for the meaning to settle. "It is not personal," I replied. "It is factual." The distinction was small in words, but absolute in impact. The man in the charcoal suit opened the folder then, revealing the first page, the letterhead visible, the structure unmistakable. He turned it slightly, positioning it so that it faced me, but angled just enough that Daniel could see it as well. Numbers. Figures. Lines that carried meaning far beyond their appearance. Daniel leaned in slightly, his expression shifting as he tried to process what he was seeing. Ashley remained still, her eyes fixed on the page, her certainty no longer intact, but not yet replaced by anything else. I did not speak. Not yet. Some truths do not need introduction. They simply need to be seen. The numbers did not need explanation, but explanation came anyway, measured and precise, carried in the calm voice of the man standing beside me. "As of this quarter," he said, his tone steady, "the total value of Mrs. Whitmore's holdings, including liquid assets, property, and trust allocations, exceeds $12.4 million. The words did not echo loudly, but they moved through the space with a weight that shifted everything they touched. Conversation stopped completely now. Not gradually. Instantly. The soft hum of the room collapsed into a silence that felt deliberate, almost staged, as if the entire evening had been leading to this exact moment without anyone realizing it. Daniel blinked once, then again, his eyes moving quickly across the page as if searching for something that would make it less real. "That cannot be right," he said quietly, though there was no conviction in his voice. The man did not react. "It is fully documented," he replied. "All accounts are verified and current." Ashley did not speak at first. Her gaze remained fixed on the paper, her posture still, her expression carefully controlled in a way that suggested she was choosing her next response with extreme precision. When she finally looked up, her smile returned, but it was thinner now, less certain. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said lightly, her tone almost amused, as though she could still redirect the narrative if she moved quickly enough. "Margaret has always preferred to keep things simple." Simple. The word lingered, fragile against the weight of what had just been revealed. I reached into my purse then, slowly, deliberately, and removed the folded document I had carried with me throughout the evening. The movement was small, but it drew attention in a way that words had not. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the edges with my fingers, then held it out, not toward Ashley, not toward Daniel, but toward the space between us, where truth no longer belonged to any one person's interpretation. "There is no misunderstanding," I said, my voice even, clear, carrying without force. Daniel's gaze shifted from the document in the man's hand to the one in mine, his expression changing in real time as the distance between assumption and reality collapsed. "Mom," he said, the word unfamiliar now, uncertain. "Why did you not say anything?" I met his eyes, holding them steady. "You did not ask," I replied. The simplicity of the answer settled over him more heavily than anything else that had been said. Ashley's composure tightened further, her posture straightening as she stepped slightly forward, positioning herself once again at the center of the moment. "This is not the time for financial discussions," she said, her tone firmer now, less polished. "We can address this privately." I turned my head slightly, acknowledging her without shifting my stance. "You have been addressing it publicly all evening," I said. No accusation. No raised voice. Just a statement. The difference between private and public had already been defined. Around us, the room remained still, the silence now filled with something more than curiosity. Recognition. People were no longer observing casually. They were recalculating. Reframing everything they had heard, everything they had assumed. The words burden, responsibility, management, all of them now suspended against a reality that did not support them. The man in the charcoal suit closed his folder quietly, stepping back just enough to remove himself from the center of attention. His role was complete. The rest belonged to me. I lowered my document slightly, not hiding it, not emphasizing it, simply holding it as what it was. Evidence. Not for argument. For clarity. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just a fraction, as if the structure he had been standing on had shifted beneath him. I thought, he began, then stopped, the sentence unfinished, unable to find a version that still made sense. I did not help him complete it. Some realizations require silence to fully form. Ashley's gaze moved quickly across the faces around us, measuring, assessing, recalibrating once again. But this time, the control she had carried all evening did not return. It hovered just out of reach, replaced by something less stable. Not panic. Not yet. But uncertainty. And uncertainty, once introduced, does not disappear easily. I folded my document once more, carefully, returning it to my purse with the same deliberate motion I had used to take it out. Then I looked at Daniel, not as the man he had presented himself to be tonight, but as the son I had known long before any of this existed. Success, I said quietly, is not just what you build. It is what you recognize. The words were not harsh. They did not need to be. He nodded once, slowly, though I could see he was still processing, still trying to understand how something so fundamental could have been so completely overlooked. Around us, the room began to move again, but differently now. Conversations resumed, but softer, more cautious, less certain of their previous direction. The energy had shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But permanently. And as I stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer defined by the role that had been assigned to me, I understood that nothing else needed to be said. The truth had already done what words could not. No one returned to the celebration the way they had before. The music continued, soft and steady, but it no longer carried the same ease. Conversations resumed in fragments, quieter, more deliberate, as if every word now required consideration before being spoken. I remained where I was for a moment longer, allowing the shift to settle fully into the room. There was no need to rush. The moment had already done its work. Daniel stood directly across from me, his expression no longer confident, no longer certain, but searching. Not for answers. For understanding. The difference mattered. Ashley, however, recovered more quickly. I could see it in the way her posture adjusted, the way her shoulders squared slightly, her chin lifting just enough to reclaim a sense of control. "This changes nothing," she said, her voice low but firm, directed at Daniel more than at me. "We are still managing everything. That does not change." Managing. The word returned, but this time it did not land the way she intended. Daniel glanced at her, then back at me, something in his expression shifting again, less certain of where he should be standing. I watched them both, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. For years, I had mistaken proximity for connection. Tonight had corrected that. I took a step back, not retreating, but creating space. Space for them to process. Space for myself to decide what came next. Because revelation is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of what follows. A woman approached me then, one of the guests who had earlier spoken in quiet assumptions. Her smile was careful now, her tone measured. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I had no idea. You must be very proud." I met her gaze briefly, then nodded once. "Pride is not the point," I replied. "Understanding is." She hesitated, unsure how to respond, then offered a polite smile before stepping away. I turned slightly, my attention moving back to Daniel. He had not moved. Not physically. But something in him had shifted, visibly, undeniably. "Why did you let us think?" he began, then stopped again, unable to complete the thought without confronting what it implied. I did not step closer. I did not soften the distance. "Because it was easier for you," I said. My voice remained even, free of accusation, but grounded in truth. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering further, the weight of recognition settling into him. Ashley stepped forward again, her voice sharper now, the edges of her composure beginning to show. "Margaret, this is not fair," she said. "If you had resources, if you had all of this, you should have been contributing more openly. We have been making decisions based on what we believed was reality." I turned my head toward her, meeting her gaze fully. "You were making decisions based on what was convenient," I replied. The distinction was small. The impact was not. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then looked away first, her certainty no longer intact, replaced by something she could not immediately reshape. Around us, the room continued its quiet recalibration. People were no longer simply observing. They were reconsidering. Conversations that had once flowed easily now paused, redirected, adjusted. The narrative had changed, and with it, the positions within it. I reached for my glass of water again, lifting it calmly, taking a small sip before setting it back down. The action was simple, ordinary, but it grounded the moment in something steady, something unaffected by perception. Daniel stepped closer then, reducing the space between us, though not eliminating it entirely. "I thought I was taking care of you," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence it had carried earlier. I looked at him for a long moment, not as the man he had presented himself to be tonight, but as the person beneath that presentation. "Taking care of someone requires knowing them," I said. "Not assuming them." The words settled. Between us, not as a reprimand, but as a correction. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, though I could see it would take time for the full meaning to reach him. Ashley did not speak again immediately. She remained still, her gaze moving briefly across the room, assessing, recalculating, searching for a position that no longer existed in the same form. Control, once disrupted, does not return unchanged. It fractures. It adapts. But it never returns exactly as it was. I adjusted the front of my blazer once more, a small, habitual gesture, then allowed my gaze to move across the room one final time. The chandeliers still cast the same warm light. The cake remained half-served. The music continued, steady and unremarkable. Everything looked the same. And yet, nothing was. I turned back toward Daniel, my posture steady, my expression unchanged. "This evening was never about the celebration," I said quietly. "It was about what you believed." He did not respond immediately. He did not need to. Some truths do not require acknowledgement in words. They require time. I gave him that space, not as a concession, but as a choice. Then, without hesitation, I stepped away, moving through the room with the same quiet composure I had carried from the beginning, but no longer at its edge, no longer undefined. The path forward was no longer shaped by assumption. It was shaped by clarity. And clarity does not ask for permission to exist. The night did not end with a confrontation. It did not need to. By the time I reached the exit, the weight of what had been revealed had already settled into every corner of that room, quietly reshaping the way each person would remember the evening. I paused briefly near the door, not to look back, but to allow myself a single moment of stillness before stepping into what came next. Behind me, the music continued, softer now, almost distant, as if it no longer belonged to me at all. I could hear fragments of conversation, low voices adjusting their tone, choosing their words more carefully than they had just an hour earlier. Perception had shifted. And once it shifts, it does not return to its original form. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the contrast immediate, clean, unfiltered. The city stretched out before me, its light steady, indifferent to everything that had just unfolded. For a moment, I stood there, breathing in the quiet, feeling the absence of expectations settle around me. No roles. No assumptions. Just clarity. The door opened behind me, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. Daniel's footsteps were slower now, less certain than they had been earlier in the night. He stopped a few feet away, leaving a space between us that felt intentional, respectful in a way it had not been before. "Mom," he said, the words steadier this time, but still searching. I turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without fully closing the distance. I did not know, he continued. I did not understand what you had built. What you still have. His voice faltered, not from weakness, but from realization. I listened without interrupting, allowing him to finish in his own time. I thought I was doing the right thing, he added. I thought I was helping. I met his eyes then, holding his gaze with a calm that did not need to prove anything. You were helping the version of me you believed in, I said. Not the one that exists. The distinction settled between us, not harsh, not unforgiving, but undeniable. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, his posture shifting as if the foundation beneath him had been replaced with something unfamiliar but more stable. What happens now? He asked. The question was simple. The answer was not. I looked out at the city again, letting the silence stretch just long enough to give the moment its weight. Now, I said, you decide what matters to you. Not what looks right. Not what sounds right. What is right? He did not respond immediately. He did not need to. Some decisions are not made in a single conversation. They are formed over time, shaped by what we choose to see once we are no longer able to ignore it. The door opened again, and this time Ashley stepped out, her presence still composed, but no longer controlled in the way it had been inside. She stopped near Daniel, her gaze moving briefly to me, then back to him. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence between the three of us was not uncomfortable. It was precise. Ashley was the first to break it. We should go back inside, she said, her tone measured, attempting to restore structure where it had been lost. Daniel did not move. He remained where he was, his attention still directed toward me. That, more than anything else, marked the shift. Ashley noticed it too. I could see it in the way her posture adjusted, the way her certainty did not return this time. It lingered just out of reach, no longer something she could step into without question. I did not address her directly. There was no need. Not every conversation requires participation. Some require observation. I stepped forward then, moving past them, not in retreat, but in continuation. The evening had served its purpose. There was nothing left for me inside that room. As I reached the edge of the sidewalk, I paused once more, not turning back, but allowing my final words to settle where they needed to. Value is not defined by what others say you are, I said quietly. It is revealed when they realize they were wrong. I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. Some truths do not require agreement to exist. I walked forward, my step steady, my posture unchanged, carrying nothing more than what had always been mine. Behind me, the night continued, but it no longer held any claim over me. The roles had shifted. The narrative had been corrected. And for the first time in a long time, I was not stepping away from something. I was stepping into something that had been waiting, quietly, all along.